In November of 1726, a Swiss surgeon named Nathaniel St. André stepped down from a carriage in Guildford, England, walked into a small house, and was handed a rabbit. The rabbit was dead. It had been delivered, the local surgeon said, by the woman lying on the bed in the next room, from inside her body, while she was awake. 2 days ago, St. André was the personal surgeon to His Majesty King George I. He had been sent down from London by direct order of the king. He took the rabbit. He examined it. He went next door, examined the woman, and stayed long enough to deliver 2 more himself. He returned to London with the rabbits sealed in jars and reported to the king that something previously impossible had occurred. A peasant woman in Surrey was giving birth to rabbits. Her name was Mary Toft, 23 years old, illiterate, married to a journeyman clothier in Godalming. 3 children. Earlier that year, her pregnancy had gone wrong, but by September the people in her village said she still looked pregnant. On the 27th of September, she went into labor. What she produced was not a baby. The family called the nearest doctor, John Howard, an obstetrician from Guildford. Over the following weeks, he documented, in his own letters to colleagues, a series of impossible deliveries, fragments of animals, parts of small creatures, eventually whole rabbits. He preserved each one in a sealed jar and lined them up on a shelf in his study. Then he wrote to London for help. London responded. The king himself responded. He sent St. André down. He sent the secretary of the Prince of Wales with him. They arrived on the 15th of November. Mary Toft delivered in front of them another rabbit. Their framework for understanding this was a theory called Maternal Impression, the accepted medical doctrine of the era. It held that a pregnant woman's thoughts and cravings could physically shape the body of her unborn child. If she stared at a strawberry, her child might be born with a strawberry birthmark. If she saw a frightening painting, her child's face might resemble it. When the doctors asked Mary what could have caused her case, she told them about an incident from early in the pregnancy. She had been working in a field. She had startled a rabbit. She had chased it. She had failed to catch it. Ever since, she had craved rabbit meat. She had not been able to stop thinking about rabbits. By the rules of accepted European medicine, the situation was now explained. In London, St. André wrote a 40-page treatise titled A Short Narrative of an Extraordinary Delivery of Rabbits. He published it. He sent copies to medical academies across Europe. He gave a copy to the king. More doctors descended on Godalming. Kyriacus Ahlers, the king's German surgeon, came skeptical and left more skeptical, but said nothing publicly. Sir Richard Manningham, the most senior man-midwife in London, came and observed. He had doubts. Howard and St. André spoke with him at length. Their careers were now staked on this. Manningham agreed to keep his doubts to himself. On the 29th of November, Mary was moved to London. She was lodged at a bagnio, a public bathhouse in Leicester Fields, for round-the-clock observation. Lords and ladies came to see her. The political writer Lord Hervey wrote to a friend, "Every creature in town, both men and women, have been to see and feel her." In London, Mary was no longer at home. She was no longer surrounded by her family. She was watched every hour by doctors and porters and curious visitors. There was no privacy. There was nowhere to be alone. The deliveries, which had come weekly for 2 months, suddenly stopped. On the 4th of December, with the entire medical establishment watching, she went into what she said was labor. Hours passed. Nothing came out. That same evening, in the corridor outside her room, a porter at the bagnio was caught carrying something concealed under his coat. It was a dead rabbit. He confessed within the hour. Mary's sister-in-law had paid him to find the smallest rabbit he could and bring it to Mary's room. They confronted Mary. She refused to confess. They left her alone for 3 days. On the morning of the 7th, Sir Richard Manningham informed her that he was prepared to perform exploratory surgery on her without anesthetic to find the source of the rabbits. Mary Toft confessed. Everything had been a lie. In her deposition, she explained where the idea of giving birth to a rabbit had come from. After her pregnancy had gone wrong in August, while she was still recovering, a traveling woman had stopped at her door. They had talked. The woman had suggested something. If Mary could produce something doctors had never seen before, news would travel. News would reach London. News would reach the king. The King of England occasionally granted small lifelong payments to people with unusual medical conditions, a royal pension, a handful of pounds a year for the rest of one's life, in exchange for being a curiosity the court could discuss at dinner. For a clothier's wife who worked in fields, who could not read, who had buried at least one child, that pension would have meant everything. It would have meant her children ate. It would have meant her husband did not break his body in the wool trade. It would have meant a different life. So she had done it herself, by hand, for 2.5 months. The pain had been real. Mary spent 1 month in prison. The charges were dropped, partly because the king's own surgeons did not want a public trial documenting how convinced they had been. She returned to her husband and her children in Godalming. She lived another 37 years. She was buried in the parish churchyard in 1763. Nathaniel St. Andre was never trusted at court again. He died 50 years later in poverty. His treatise on rabbit births stayed in libraries he could no longer afford to enter. John Howard returned to Guildford. The shelf in his study was emptied. His reputation never recovered. The artist William Hogarth drew a satirical cartoon of the case in December of 1726. It is still on display 300 years later in the British Museum. Maternal impression, the medical theory that had held for nearly 2 centuries that a pregnant woman's thoughts could reshape her unborn child, never fully recovered either. By the end of the century, no respectable European medical school was teaching it. Now ask yourself, suppose you were pregnant, and every day you stared at the face of a famous person. Do you believe the child you were carrying would be born looking like them?